Today we're covering 5 terrifying moments that appear constantly in veteran testimonies and military records. What you're about to hear isn't sanitized history. This is the raw, visceral reality of what made Vietnam such a psychologically brutal conflict. Some of this might be difficult to hear, but it's important that we understand what these men went through. If you're a veteran watching this, you already know these fears intimately. For everyone else, pay attention, because this is the side of war that rarely makes it into textbooks or movies. The first fear we need to discuss is about a specific role that every infantry soldier dreaded, being the point man. In military terminology, walking point meant being the first soldier in a patrol formation. The point man walked ahead of the rest of the unit, usually 10 to 20 meters in front, serving as the early warning system for the entire patrol. This wasn't a volunteer position most of the time. Units would rotate who walked point, meaning every soldier knew that eventually it would be their turn. And when it was your turn, you knew you'd just become the most likely person in your unit to die that day. According to military casualty statistics and unit records, point men had significantly higher casualty rates than any other position in the patrol formation. Some studies suggest point men were 3 to 4 times more likely to be killed or wounded than soldiers in the middle or rear of the formation. First to everything. The point man was first to trigger booby traps, first to step on mines, first to walk into ambushes, first to encounter enemy soldiers, first into every deadly situation the patrol would face. Veterans described the psychological burden of knowing that every step you took, you were testing the ground for everyone behind you. If there was a mine on the trail, your foot would find it. If there was a tripwire across the path, your leg would hit it. If the Viet Cong had set up an ambush, you'd walk right into the kill zone before you even knew it was there. One infantry soldier described it in a documented interview. Walking point was like playing Russian roulette with every step. You knew that statistically, you were going to hit something eventually. It wasn't if, it was when. You just hoped when it happened, it would kill you quick instead of leaving you screaming with your legs blown off. Constant alertness. The point man had to maintain absolute alertness at all times. You were scanning the ground for disturbed earth that might indicate a mine. You were watching at eye level for tripwires. You were looking up for tree snipers. You were listening for any sound that might indicate enemy presence. You were watching the vegetation for signs of camouflage positions. This level of alertness was exhausting. Veterans described the mental fatigue of walking point for hours, knowing that one moment of distraction could kill you and everyone behind you. Your eyes hurt from scanning constantly. Your mind raced trying to process every visual input. The stress was physically exhausting. One Marine who regularly walked point stated, "After a few hours on point, your brain starts playing tricks on you. You see threats that aren't there. Every shadow looks like a person. Every vine looks like a tripwire. But you can't let your guard down, because the one time you think you're imagining things might be the one time it's real." Target identification. The point man was also responsible for spotting enemy forces before they spotted the patrol. This created an impossible situation. You needed to see the enemy first, but in the dense jungle, visibility was often measured in feet, not yards. Veterans described the constant awareness that enemy soldiers could be 10 feet away and you wouldn't see them until you were right on top of them. The jungle vegetation was so thick that you could walk past a concealed enemy position and never know it was there. The Viet Cong were masters of camouflage. They could remain motionless for hours, covered in vegetation, waiting for a patrol to pass. The point man might walk within arm's reach of an enemy soldier and never detect them, until it was too late. Ambush response. When a patrol walked into an ambush, the point man was in the worst possible position. You were isolated from the rest of your unit, in front of everyone, and directly in the enemy's kill zone. According to tactical analyses of ambush incidents, the point man had only seconds to react, drop to the ground, return fire, and try to survive long enough for the rest of the patrol to respond. But often, the point man was cut down in the first seconds of the ambush, before he could even react. Veterans described the knowledge that if you were on point when the ambush was sprung, your survival depended entirely on luck. There was no skill involved, no training that could save you. Either the first burst of fire missed you, or it didn't. One squad leader described losing point men. "We went through point men like ammunition. They'd last a few weeks, maybe a month if they were good and lucky, and then they'd step on something or walk into something, and that was it. We'd get a new guy, rotate him to point, and start the cycle over again. The psychological toll. The psychological impact of walking point created lasting trauma for many veterans. The constant awareness that you were the most exposed, most vulnerable, most likely to die created a specific kind of anxiety that veterans describe as different from general combat stress. You couldn't share the burden with anyone else. You were alone out front, making life or death decisions with every step. The rest of the patrol depended on you, but you couldn't depend on anyone because they were all behind you. Veterans who regularly walked point described developing superstitions, rituals, and obsessive behaviors trying to increase their odds of survival. Some would take the same number of steps with each foot. Some would avoid stepping on certain colors of soil. Some would pray with every step. Anything to feel like they had some control over their fate. As soldiers got closer to the end of their tours, the rotation to point became even more psychologically difficult. Veterans described the crushing anxiety of being assigned point when you had only weeks or days left in country. You'd survived 11 months. You could see the finish line, and then you'd get assigned to walk point, knowing that after all you'd survived, you could still die in the last days of your tour because your foot found a mine or you walked into an ambush. One veteran described this experience. I had 2 weeks left. 2 weeks, and I'd be on a plane home. They put me on point for a patrol. I almost refused. I'd made it so far, and now I'm supposed to walk first into whatever's out there? I was terrified the whole patrol. Every step felt like it might be my last. Perhaps one of the most bitter aspects of being point was that there was little recognition for doing one of the most dangerous jobs in the infantry. Point men who successfully led patrols through dangerous territory without casualties were doing their job. Point men who triggered booby traps or walked into ambushes were blamed for not being alert enough. Veterans described the feeling that walking point was a losing proposition. If everything went well, nobody noticed. If something went wrong, it was your fault. The second fear centers on one of Vietnam's defining features, its extensive network of rivers, streams, and waterways, and the unique dangers they presented. Riverine warfare. Vietnam's geography meant that rivers were crucial to transportation and military operations. The Mekong Delta, in particular, was a maze of waterways that required American forces to conduct extensive riverine operations. The U.S. Navy's River Patrol Force, known as the Brown Water Navy, operated patrol boats throughout Vietnam's waterways. These operations were among the most dangerous missions of the war. According to naval records, riverine forces faced casualty rates that exceeded many ground combat units. The reasons become clear when you understand the nature of water-based combat in Vietnam. Patrol boat vulnerability. Patrol boats on rivers were exposed targets. The Viet Cong and NVA would set up ambush positions along riverbanks, often on both sides simultaneously, creating a crossfire that patrol boats had no way to escape. Veterans of riverine operations described the constant tension of moving down rivers, knowing that the vegetation along both banks could be concealing enemy forces with machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, and recoilless rifles. One Navy veteran described river patrols. You're moving down the river, and you can see the jungle on both sides, thick vegetation right down to the water's edge. You know they're watching you. You know they're in there. You just don't know when they'll open fire. And when they do, you're sitting in a boat with nowhere to go. The boats themselves offered minimal protection. They had some armor plating, but rockets and heavy machine gun fire could penetrate. Crews were largely exposed, operating weapons from open positions on deck. Underwater obstacles. The Viet Cong planted underwater obstacles specifically designed to damage or destroy patrol boats. Sharpened stakes were driven into river bottoms at angles designed to rip open the hulls of boats passing over them. These stakes were often positioned just below the water surface, invisible to boat crews. Veterans described the sickening sound of the boat's hull scraping against underwater obstacles, never knowing if this was the one that would tear open the hull and sink the boat. Underwater mines were another threat. The Viet Cong would place mines in rivers, either command detonated from shore or triggered by the boat itself. The explosion from an underwater mine could be catastrophic, often sinking the boat and killing or wounding most of the crew. Drowning with gear. Infantry soldiers who had to cross rivers, or operate near water faced a specific fear: drowning because of the weight of their equipment. A fully equipped soldier carried 60 to 80 pounds of gear: rifle, ammunition, radio equipment, grenades, water, rations, and more. This weight, combined with boots and wet uniforms, made swimming nearly impossible. Veterans described the terror of crossing rivers or streams, knowing that if you lost your footing and went under, the weight of your gear would drag you down. Unit SOPs, standard operating procedures, often called for removing gear before water crossings, but this meant being defenseless if attacked during the crossing. Multiple documented incidents involve soldiers drowning during river crossings when they lost their footing or when the water was deeper than expected. One veteran described watching a fellow soldier slip off a log crossing, go under, and never surface, dragged down by his equipment before anyone could reach him. Sampan attacks. Sampans, small Vietnamese boats, presented a constant identification challenge. They were used by civilians for fishing and transportation, but they were also used by the Viet Cong to transport weapons, supplies, and fighters. Patrol boat crews described the impossible calculus of approaching sampans. Was it a civilian boat, or was it carrying Viet Cong who would open fire at close range? Make the wrong decision, and either you'd kill civilians or you'd be killed by enemy fighters you mistook for civilians. The Viet Cong exploited this confusion. They would approach American patrol boats and sampans that looked like civilian vessels, get close, and then open fire with automatic weapons and throw grenades. By the time American crews realized they were under attack, the enemy was already at point-blank range. One riverine veteran described the psychological burden. Every sampan could be a threat. Every fishing boat could have weapons hidden under the nets. We had to approach every Vietnamese boat as if it might kill us, but we also couldn't just shoot every boat we saw. It was an impossible situation. Muddy water hazards. The biological hazards of water operations added another layer of misery and danger. Rivers, streams, and swamps were full of leeches that would attach to any exposed skin and to areas that weren't exposed. Veterans of riverine and delta operations described pulling leeches off after every water operation, dozens or hundreds of them. The leeches themselves weren't deadly, but the wounds they left were prone to infection in the contaminated water. Waterborne parasites presented serious health risks. Schistosomiasis, also called snail fever, was transmitted through contact with contaminated water. The parasitic worms would penetrate skin and cause serious internal damage. There was no way to avoid exposure during water operations. Other waterborne diseases included various bacterial infections, amoebic dysentery, and fungal infections. Anytime you operated in or around water, you were exposing yourself to diseases that could incapacitate or kill you. Alligators and water snakes. Vietnamese waters contained estuarine crocodiles, called alligators by American soldiers, that could grow over 20 feet long and were aggressive predators. While attacks were rare, they did occur, and the knowledge that crocodiles inhabited the waters added psychological stress to water operations. Water snakes, including venomous species, were common in rivers and swamps. Veterans described seeing snakes swimming in the water around them during operations, never knowing if they were venomous or harmless. One sailor described the experience. You'd be on the boat, and you'd see snakes swimming in the water. Sometimes they'd be swimming toward the boat. You didn't know if they were aggressive or just passing by. You didn't know if they were venomous or not. It was just another thing trying to kill you. Monsoon flash floods. During monsoon season, rivers could rise dramatically and rapidly. Small streams could become raging torrents in minutes. Veterans described being caught in flash floods during operations, with water levels rising so fast that positions became untenable. Soldiers in low-lying areas during monsoons faced the danger of being trapped by rising water. Unit positions could be flooded, forcing evacuation during active combat. The water would wash away equipment, defensive positions, and supplies. One veteran described a fire base during monsoon season. The river rose so fast we had to evacuate. Everything was getting washed away. We're trying to save ammunition and radio equipment while water's pouring into our bunkers. And we still had to worry about enemy attack during the evacuation. It was chaos. Limited escape routes. Perhaps the most psychologically difficult aspect of water combat was the limited escape routes. On land, if you were ambushed, You could maneuver, take cover, and attempt to flank enemy positions. On water, your options were severely limited. If a patrol boat was ambushed, there was nowhere to go except forward, backward, or to shore, all of which might be exactly what the enemy wanted. Veterans describe feeling trapped on boats during ambushes, taking fire from both banks with no way to escape the kill zone except to push through it. Infantry soldiers caught crossing water when ambushed faced similarly limited options. You couldn't effectively take cover in water. You couldn't move quickly. You were essentially trapped in the middle of the water while taking fire from concealed positions on shore. The psychological impact of this vulnerability appears repeatedly in veteran accounts of water operations. The feeling of being completely exposed, unable to defend yourself effectively, unable to escape. It created a specific kind of terror that many describe as worse than land combat. The third fear centers on one of the most tactically devastating situations soldiers faced, being caught in crossfire from multiple enemy positions. The L-shaped ambush. The L-shaped ambush was a Viet Cong and NVA specialty that created overlapping fields of fire designed to trap American units in a kill zone with no escape route. The setup was tactically brilliant and psychologically devastating. The enemy would position forces in an L shape, typically along a trail or in an area where American forces were likely to move. The base of the L would be positioned perpendicular to the American line of movement, while the vertical arm of the L ran parallel to it. When the ambush was triggered, American forces would be hit simultaneously from two directions with overlapping machine gun fire. According to after-action reports and tactical analyses, L-shaped ambushes inflicted higher casualties than linear ambushes because they limited escape routes and created confusion about where fire was coming from. Veterans described the disorientation of being hit from multiple directions simultaneously. Your instinct is to take cover from the fire you're receiving, but taking cover from one position often exposes you to fire from the other position. Moving in any direction brings you under fire from a different angle. One squad leader described being caught in an L-shaped ambush. We took fire from our front and our left side at the same time. Guys were diving for cover, but there wasn't any real cover because no matter where you were in someone's line of fire. We had men hit in the first 30 seconds before we even understood what was happening. 360-degree ambush. These ambushes typically occurred when units moved into areas that the Viet Cong or NVA had prepared extensively. The enemy would allow the American unit to move into the center of their positions, then open fire from all sides simultaneously. Military records document several major battles where American units found themselves surrounded, the Ia Drang Valley, Firebase Illingworth, and others. But smaller-scale encirclements happened regularly and often went unrecorded beyond unit after-action reports. Veterans who survived 360-degree ambushes described the absolute terror of realizing you're taking fire from every direction. There's no safe direction to move, no way to identify a secure area. Every position is exposed to enemy fire from multiple directions. One Marine described such an ambush. We were taking fire from literally everywhere. You'd duck behind a tree for cover from fire coming from one direction, and you'd get hit from behind. There was nowhere to go. We just had to hunker down and call for air support and pray it would arrive before we all died. Automatic weapon crossfire. The Viet Cong and NVA used machine guns and automatic rifles to create intersecting fields of fire that turned areas into kill zones where survival was nearly impossible. According to tactical manuals and military analyses, intersecting machine gun fire is one of the most effective ways to prevent enemy movement and inflict mass casualties. The Viet Cong understood this and positioned weapons accordingly. Veterans described the sound of machine gun fire coming from multiple directions, the tracers crisscrossing through the air, the impossibility of identifying which direction to move to escape the fire. The AK-47's distinctive sound, often described as a crack rather than the M16 sharper report, made it recognizable. Hearing that sound from multiple directions simultaneously created an immediate recognition that you were in serious trouble. Ricochets and flying shrapnel. Crossfire situations created additional hazards beyond direct fire. Bullets hitting trees, rocks, and ground would ricochet in unpredictable directions. In dense jungle where you were surrounded by hard surfaces, Ricochets were constant during firefights. Veterans described being hit by ricochets, bullets that bounced off trees or rocks and struck them from unexpected angles. The wounds from ricochets could be as serious as direct hits, and the randomness of them added to the psychological terror. When grenades and rockets were added to crossfire situations, the shrapnel from explosions would fly in all directions. Multiple explosions in confined spaces created storms of shrapnel that made survival largely a matter of luck. One soldier described combat in crossfire. Bullets were hitting trees and ricocheting everywhere. You'd see bark exploding off trees all around you. Grenades going off sent shrapnel flying in every direction. There was so much metal flying around that being hit wasn't a matter of if, it was when and how bad. Communication breakdown. Crossfire situations often led to communication breakdowns within American units. The noise of gunfire from multiple directions, explosions, and men shouting made it impossible to hear radio communications or verbal commands. Veterans described the chaos of trying to coordinate a response to an ambush when you couldn't hear your radio, couldn't hear your squad leader shouting orders, couldn't tell who was shooting at what. This communication breakdown meant that responses to crossfire situations were often uncoordinated. Soldiers would make individual decisions about where to move and where to shoot, sometimes creating friendly fire situations as different parts of the unit fired in different directions without coordination. Friendly forces in the line of fire. One of the most psychologically difficult aspects of crossfire situations was knowing that returning fire in one direction might hit friendly forces who were positioned in that direction. In a 360-degree ambush or complex crossfire situation, American forces would be scattered in multiple positions. Returning fire toward one enemy position risked hitting Americans who were on the other side of that position. Veterans described the impossible decision-making in these situations. Do you shoot back and risk hitting your own men? Do you hold fire and remain a target? There was no good answer. One platoon sergeant described this nightmare. We had guys scattered all over after the initial ambush. I could see muzzle flashes from enemy positions, but I knew we had men in that direction. I couldn't give the order to fire because we'd hit our own people. We had to maneuver first, but moving under fire from multiple directions was almost impossible. Suppression from multiple angles. Military doctrine teaches that suppressive fire, fire designed to keep the enemy's heads down, is effective when it comes from one direction. But when suppressive fire comes from multiple directions simultaneously, it becomes nearly impossible to function. Veterans caught in crossfire describe the paralysis that sets in when you're being suppressed from multiple angles. You can't raise your head to shoot without exposing yourself to fire from multiple positions. You can't move without coming under fire. You're essentially pinned down with no options. This suppression could last minutes or hours, depending on when American air support or artillery could respond. During that time, soldiers had to remain in whatever cover they'd found, often inadequate, while taking sustained fire from multiple directions. Extraction under fire. When American units caught in crossfire needed extraction, the helicopter landing zones often came under fire from multiple directions as well. This created situations where helicopters were taking fire, soldiers trying to board were exposed to fire from multiple angles, and the entire extraction process became a nightmare of overlapping dangers. Multiple documented incidents involve helicopters being hit from multiple directions during extraction from crossfire situations, forcing them to abort the extraction and leaving soldiers on the ground under continued fire. One door gunner described extractions from crossfire situations. We'd come in to get guys out, and we'd be taking fire from 3 or 4 different positions. The pilots are trying to hold steady while taking hits. We're returning fire in multiple directions, and guys are trying to board while bullets are flying from everywhere. Some extractions, we'd have to leave because the fire was too intense, knowing we were leaving men behind to deal with it. The fourth fear was a soldier's worst nightmare, running out of ammunition during combat. The math of combat. Every soldier in Vietnam carried a finite amount of ammunition. The standard load for an M16 rifle was typically 20 magazines, each holding 20 rounds, for a total of 400 rounds. Machine gunners carried more, but it was still a limited supply. In sustained firefights, ammunition consumption was enormous. According to military studies, American forces often expended thousands of rounds for every enemy casualty. The dense jungle made accurate fire difficult, leading to high ammunition expenditure with limited effectiveness. Veterans describe the mental math they do during firefights: counting magazines, counting rounds, calculating how long their ammunition would last if the firefight continued at the current intensity, wondering if resupply would arrive before they ran dry. One infantry soldier described this calculation: you'd be in a firefight, and part of your brain is always counting. How many mags have I used? How many do I have left? If this keeps going for another 20 minutes, will I have anything left to shoot? It's terrifying knowing you're burning through ammunition and not knowing when the fight will end. Resupply failures. Ammunition resupply depended on helicopters being able to land or on soldiers being able to physically carry ammunition forward. When weather was bad, when landing zones were too hot, or when units were cut off, resupply became impossible. Multiple documented battles involved American units running critically low on ammunition because helicopters couldn't get through. The siege of Firebase Ripcord, various LRRP team extractions, and countless smaller engagements saw units facing the possibility of running completely dry. Veterans described the rising panic as ammunition levels dropped and resupply wasn't arriving. Radio calls become more desperate. Ammunition discipline, carefully controlling your rate of fire, becomes critical. But in intense combat, discipline breaks down. One squad leader described a resupply failure. We've been in contact for 3 hours. We were down to our last few magazines. We're calling for resupply, and they're telling us the LZ is too hot. They can't land. We're telling them we're going to be out of ammunition in 15 minutes. They're saying they'll try. Meanwhile, we're still taking fire. Weapon malfunctions. The M16 rifle's reliability issues in Vietnam created additional ammunition-related fears. The weapon was notorious for jamming, particularly in the early years of the war before improvements were made. Veterans described the terror of having your rifle jam during a firefight when you were already low on ammunition. The jam meant you had to stop, clear the malfunction, and hope you could get the weapon functioning again before you were overrun. Cleaning rods became precious items. Soldiers who didn't have cleaning rods with them couldn't clear jams effectively. Multiple documented incidents involve soldiers being killed while trying to clear jammed weapons. One Marine described the M16's problems. The rifle would jam constantly. You'd be firing, and suddenly nothing. You're pulling the charging handle, trying to clear it, and bullets are hitting all around you. You've got maybe 30 seconds to get it working before you're a casualty. If you were already low on ammo and your rifle jammed, you were basically defenseless. As ammunition levels dropped during prolonged engagements, leaders had to make impossible decisions about rationing fire. Orders would come to limit fire to only clear targets, to shoot only semi-automatic instead of automatic, to conserve ammunition. But combat situations don't always allow for careful, controlled fire. When you're being overrun, when you're in a crossfire situation, when you're facing a human wave attack, fire discipline breaks down because survival instinct takes over. Veterans describe the conflict between orders to conserve ammunition and the immediate need to put rounds downrange to survive. The psychological stress of trying to be selective with your fire while under intense pressure was immense. When some soldiers ran out while others still had ammunition, desperate redistribution efforts would begin. Magazines and loose rounds would be passed between soldiers during lulls in the fighting. But this redistribution had its own problems. Different weapons used different ammunition. M16s, M60 machine guns, M79 grenade launchers, and pistols all had different ammunition types. You couldn't share M60 belts with rifle ammunition needs. Veterans described the desperate calls during firefights. Who's got ammo? I'm out. I've got 2 mags left. The coordination required to redistribute ammunition effectively while under fire was difficult and dangerous. One veteran described this situation. I ran dry, completely out. I'm yelling for ammunition, and the guy next to me slides over his last 2 magazines. Now we're both almost out. We're in the middle of a firefight, and we're basically counting down to being defenseless. The last magazine. Veterans consistently describe the specific terror of being down to their last magazine. You've got 20 rounds left, maybe 15 if you've already fired some. That's all that stands between you and being completely defenseless. The psychological impact of seeing that last magazine in your pouch, knowing there's nothing after it, created a panic that veterans describe as distinct from other combat fears. Do you empty it and hope the fight ends before you're completely out? Do you ration it one round at a time and hope you can make it last? Either way, you're basically done. One soldier described reaching his last magazine. I pulled out my last mag and slapped it in. That sound, the click of a magazine seating when you know it's the last one. That's a sound I still hear sometimes. You know that after these 20 rounds, you've got nothing. You're trying to make every round count, but you're also terrified you'll need more than 20. Hand-to-hand combat preparation. When ammunition ran critically low or ran out completely, soldiers prepared for hand-to-hand combat. Bayonets would be fixed. Knives would be drawn. Entrenching tools, small shovels, became weapons. This preparation represented the worst-case scenario. You were about to face the enemy with nothing but bladed weapons and your hands. The terror of this moment appears repeatedly in veteran accounts. Multiple documented incidents involve American soldiers engaging in hand-to-hand combat after running out of ammunition. The battles at Landing Zone Albany, various firebase overruns, and smaller engagements saw Americans fighting with knives, entrenching tools, and fists when ammunition was exhausted. One veteran described this moment. "We were out. Completely out of ammunition." That's when you know you're in the worst possible situation. You're about to fight with knives and shovels against an enemy that still has bullets. Grenades as last resort. When rifle ammunition was exhausted, grenades became the last-ditch weapons. But grenades were finite too. Most soldiers carried only a few. Once the grenades were gone, there was nothing left. Veterans described the desperation of using their last grenades, knowing that after these few explosions, they'd be completely defenseless. The psychological impact of throwing your last, knowing that's it, there's nothing more, created a specific kind of terror. Being overrun while low. The ultimate nightmare was being overrun by enemy forces while low on or out of ammunition. This wasn't theoretical. It happened regularly during the war. When bases or positions were overrun, ammunition shortages were often a contributing factor. Defenders who ran out of ammunition couldn't maintain defensive fire, allowing enemy forces to breach perimeters and close to hand-to-hand range. Veterans who survived being overrun while ammunition was exhausted describe it as the most terrifying experience of their service. Fighting with whatever you could find, rifles used as clubs, knives, anything, while enemy soldiers poured into your position. The fifth fear centers on the helicopter, the symbol of American mobility in Vietnam, but also a flying death trap that could fall from the sky at any moment. The statistics. According to military records, approximately 5,000 helicopters were lost in Vietnam. That number includes helicopters shot down by enemy fire, lost to mechanical failure, and destroyed in crashes due to weather or pilot error. Over 2,000 helicopter crew members were killed, and thousands more were wounded. These statistics made helicopter operations some of the most dangerous jobs in Vietnam. For soldiers who depended on helicopters for transportation, medical evacuation, and resupply, every flight carried real risk. You weren't just worried about ground combat. You were worried about the machine you were riding and falling out of the sky. Mechanical failures. Helicopters are complex machines with thousands of moving parts, and in Vietnam's harsh environment, mechanical failures were common. The heat, humidity, dust, and constant operation created conditions where maintenance was difficult and failures were frequent. Veterans described the sounds and sensations of mechanical problems during flight. The change in engine pitch, the vibration that shouldn't be there, the warning lights, the sudden loss of altitude, the moment when you realize something is very wrong and you're hundreds of feet in the air. One door gunner described a mechanical failure. "We were at about 800 feet when the engine started making a sound like metal grinding on metal. The pilot's yelling into his radio, and we're starting to drop. You're in the air with no control, no way to save yourself. You just have to hope the pilot can get it down before it falls completely apart." Tail rotor failures were particularly feared. The tail rotor provides directional control. Without it, the helicopter spins uncontrollably. Multiple documented crashes resulted from tail rotor failures, with helicopters spinning to the ground while crew and passengers were helpless to do anything. Main rotor failures were often instantly catastrophic. If the main rotor failed, the helicopter dropped like a stone. There was no recovery from a main rotor failure. It was a matter of seconds until impact. Being shot down. The Viet Cong and NVA had extensive anti-aircraft capabilities. heavy machine guns, small arms fire from multiple positions, and later in the war, heat-seeking missiles made flying helicopters in Vietnam extremely dangerous. According to military records, over 2,000 helicopters were lost to enemy fire. For crew members and passengers, being shot down meant facing multiple deadly threats simultaneously: fire damage, crash impact, potential explosion, and enemy forces closing in on the crash site. Veterans described the experience of taking fire in helicopters: the sound of bullets hitting the aircraft, the alarm in the pilot's voice, the sudden changes in flight as the pilot tried to evade, the realization that you might be going down. One infantry soldier described being shot down. "We were coming into a hot LZ, and suddenly the helicopter lurched. Bullets were coming through the floor and walls. The pilot's screaming, 'We're hit, we're going down.' You're strapped in, you can't do anything, and you're falling toward the ground knowing this is going to hurt if you're lucky and kill you if you're not." Hot LZ insertions. Landing zones under fire, hot LZs, were among the most dangerous moments in Vietnam. Helicopters had to slow down and hover to drop off troops, making them vulnerable targets. The door gunners would be firing to suppress enemy positions. Bullets would be hitting the helicopter, and soldiers had to jump out into a landing zone where they were immediately under fire, often before the helicopter even touched down. Veterans described the terror of approaching a hot LZ. You could see tracers coming up from the ground. You could hear impacts on the helicopter. You knew that when the door opened, you had to jump out into that fire. One soldier described hot LZ insertions. You'd see the LZ coming up, and you could see muzzle flashes from the tree line. The door gunner is firing, spent shells are flying everywhere, and then it's your turn to jump. You jump out into hell and just hope you don't get hit before you hit the ground. Mid-air collisions. During large operations involving multiple helicopters flying in formation, mid-air collisions were a real danger. In the chaos of combat insertions, with helicopters maneuvering in confined spaces while taking fire, collisions happened. According to accident reports, several mid-air collisions occurred during major operations. When helicopters collided, both aircraft typically went down, killing everyone aboard. Veterans described the fear of flying in large formations, watching other helicopters nearby, knowing that one pilot error or sudden evasive maneuver could result in aircraft hitting each other. Ditching in water. Helicopters that were damaged over water faced the additional danger of ditching. Helicopters are not designed to float. They sink rapidly when they hit water. For crew and passengers in a helicopter going down over water, survival depended on getting out of the aircraft before it sank. But the crash impact could injure or stun occupants. The doors might be jammed, and the weight of gear could drag soldiers down even if they escaped the aircraft. Multiple documented incidents involve helicopters ditching in rivers or coastal waters. Survivors described the chaos of the crash, the rush of water coming in, the frantic struggle to escape before the aircraft sank. One survivor of a water ditching described it: "We hit the water hard. The impact threw me forward, and then water started pouring in. The helicopter was sinking fast. I got my belt off and kicked for the door, but the helicopter was already under. I barely made it to the surface. Some of the guys didn't get out." Door gunner and crew chief exposure. Door gunners and crew chiefs were completely exposed to enemy fire throughout the flight. They sat or stood in open doors with no protection, making them priority targets for enemy gunners. According to casualty statistics, door gunners and crew chiefs had some of the highest death rates of any position in Vietnam. They were exposed from takeoff to landing, and any enemy fire directed at the helicopter had a good chance of hitting them. Veterans who served as door gunners described the unique terror of their position. You could see the enemy shooting at you. You could see the muzzle flashes. Sometimes you could even see the tracers coming toward you. And there was nothing between you and those bullets except air. One door gunner described his experience. "You're sitting in an open door at 1,000 feet with a machine gun, and people are shooting at you from the ground. You can see them. You're completely exposed. Nothing to hide behind, nowhere to take cover. You just hang on and shoot back and hope they miss." Medevac under fire. Medical evacuation helicopters, dust-offs, had to land in contested areas to pick up wounded soldiers. Often these LZs were still under fire, meaning the helicopter, crew, and medics were exposed while loading casualties. The courage of dust-off pilots and crews was legendary, but their missions were extraordinarily dangerous. They had to hover in areas where enemy forces were present, often taking fire while loading wounded soldiers who couldn't defend themselves. Veterans describe watching medevac helicopters come in under fire, seeing them take hits, wondering if the bird would make it out or if it would go down with everyone aboard: wounded soldiers, medics, and crew. One medic described calling for dust-off. "We had 3 urgent casualties who would die without immediate evacuation. The dust-off came in taking fire. We're loading wounded while bullets are hitting the helicopter. The pilot's holding steady, rotors spinning, and you know any second a lucky shot could bring the whole thing down." Catastrophic fire. Helicopters carried fuel, ammunition, and often explosives. When hit in the wrong place, they could catch fire or explode catastrophically. Veterans describe the horror of seeing helicopters explode in midair after taking enemy fire. The fireball, the falling debris, the knowledge that everyone aboard died instantly. These images became recurring nightmares for many who witnessed them. For crew and passengers in a helicopter that caught fire, survival depended on getting on the ground immediately and escaping the aircraft before it exploded or became completely engulfed in flames. One veteran described a helicopter fire. "We took a hit in the fuel system. There was fire in the back of the bird. The pilot put it down hard in a clearing, and we all scrambled out. 10 seconds after we cleared the aircraft, it was completely engulfed. If the pilot had hesitated even a moment, we'd all have burned." Brownouts and whiteouts. In dusty or sandy conditions, helicopter rotor wash would create brownouts, clouds of dust that made it impossible for pilots to see the ground. In snow or certain weather conditions, whiteouts created similar problems. Landing in brownout or whiteout conditions was extremely dangerous. Pilots couldn't see obstacles, couldn't judge distance to the ground, and had to land essentially blind. Multiple crashes resulted from brownout conditions. Veterans described the fear of being in a helicopter trying to land in a brownout. The aircraft descending with zero visibility, not knowing if you were about to hit level ground or crash into obstacles. The jarring impact when the helicopter finally hit ground, hoping the landing gear wouldn't collapse. Auto-rotation emergencies. When a helicopter lost engine power, pilots could attempt an auto-rotation, using the air flowing up through the rotor to slow the descent and make a controlled crash landing. But auto-rotations were difficult maneuvers with low success rates, especially in combat conditions. Veterans described the sinking feeling when the engine quit and the pilot announced he was attempting auto-rotation. You were going down, and whether you survived depended entirely on the pilot's skill and luck. The ground was coming up fast. The pilot was trying to bleed off speed while maintaining rotor RPM, and everyone aboard knew that any mistake meant a hard crash that would likely kill or seriously injure everyone. One survivor of an auto-rotation described it: "The engine quit, and we started dropping. The pilot said, 'Hold on,' and we're falling fast. He's working the controls, and you can feel him trying to slow us down. We hit hard, really hard. The helicopter broke apart on impact. I was thrown clear and survived, but 2 guys in back didn't make it." Rotor blade strikes. On the ground, rotor blades were deadly hazards. The main rotor blades were spinning at high speed, and anyone who walked into them was killed instantly. The tail rotor, though smaller, was equally deadly and harder to see. Multiple documented incidents involve soldiers, often disoriented from combat or evacuating wounded, walking into rotor blades and being killed. The chaos around landing zones made these accidents more likely. Veterans described the constant awareness required around helicopters. You had to know where the rotors were at all times. A moment of inattention, a few steps in the wrong direction, and you could walk into blades that would kill you before you even realized your mistake. Overloaded aircraft. During emergency evacuations or intense operations, helicopters were sometimes loaded beyond their safe capacity. Too much weight affected performance and made crashes more likely. Pilots sometimes made the choice to overload rather than leave men behind, but this decision put everyone at risk. An overloaded helicopter might not be able to climb effectively, might not be able to maneuver to avoid enemy fire, and might crash if it encountered any additional problems. Veterans describe being on overloaded helicopters, feeling the aircraft struggle to gain altitude, wondering if the pilot had pushed it too far, and whether they'd make it out of the landing zone before the helicopter ran out of power. Weather hazards. Vietnam's weather created additional aviation dangers. Monsoon rains reduced visibility, created strong winds and turbulence, and made flying extremely hazardous. Thunderstorms with severe turbulence, heavy rain that made navigation difficult, and low clouds that forced helicopters to fly dangerously low all contributed to crashes. Veterans describe flights in bad weather. Zero visibility, severe turbulence throwing the helicopter around, pilots flying on instruments alone hoping they didn't hit a mountain or fly into the ground. One crew chief described a monsoon flight. "We were in clouds so thick you couldn't see the rotor blades from inside the helicopter. We're getting thrown around by turbulence. The pilot is flying purely on instruments. We couldn't see anything, no ground reference, no horizon, nothing. We were essentially blind, hoping the instruments were accurate and the pilot's navigation was correct." Crash survival and evasion. Surviving a helicopter crash was only the first challenge. Crash survivors often found themselves in hostile territory, possibly injured, with enemy forces moving toward the crash site. The Viet Cong and NVA knew that downed helicopters were priority targets. They would move toward crash sites to capture or kill survivors and to salvage weapons and equipment from the wreckage. Veterans who survived crashes described the immediate need to establish security, treat wounded, and call for rescue while knowing that enemy forces were probably already moving toward their position. One pilot who survived being shot down described the aftermath. "We crashed in the jungle. 3 of us survived the impact. We're hurt, the helicopter's smoking, and we know Charlie heard us go down. We got on the radio calling for rescue, but we also knew we might not have much time before we had to fight or evade. We set up security and waited, listening for enemy forces coming through the jungle." The psychological burden. For soldiers who depended on helicopters for transportation, every flight carried the knowledge that the helicopter could be shot down, could suffer mechanical failure, or could crash. This created a specific anxiety around flying that many veterans carried long after the war. Some veterans described their first few helicopter flights as terrifying experiences. Others describe how the fear diminished with repetition but never completely went away. Still others describe specific incidents, seeing a helicopter shot down, surviving a crash themselves, that made every subsequent flight an anxiety-producing experience. The sound of helicopter rotors triggers emotional responses in many Vietnam veterans decades after the war. For some, it's nostalgia or comfort. For others, particularly those who survived crashes or saw helicopters shot down, it's anxiety and flashbacks to moments of terror. These 5 fears, being point man, river and water combat, crossfire situations, running out of ammunition, and helicopter crashes, complete our trilogy on the greatest fears of the Vietnam War. Across all 3 videos, we've covered 15 distinct fears that define the Vietnam experience. What unites all of them is the constant, inescapable nature of the threats. There was no safe position, no safe location, no safe moment. Whether you were walking point at the front of a patrol or in the middle of the formation, whether you were on a riverboat or in a helicopter, whether you were at a firebase or on patrol, danger was omnipresent. The enemy was invisible, the environment was hostile, your own weapons and equipment could fail, and death could come from any direction at any moment. According to comprehensive studies of Vietnam veterans and PTSD research spanning decades, these constant, overlapping threats created psychological damage that proved more severe and persistent than combat trauma from wars with clearer boundaries between combat and safety. The soldiers who served in Vietnam carried burdens that were unique to that conflict. The combination of guerrilla warfare, hostile environment, unclear objectives, rotating individual replacements rather than unit deployments, and the nature of the threats they faced created a perfect storm of psychological stressors. Understanding these 15 fears, from booby traps to helicopter crashes, from deadly wildlife to running out of ammunition, is essential to understanding what Vietnam veterans experienced and what many still carry with them today. These weren't just soldiers doing their jobs. These were young men, many barely out of high school, facing threats from every direction with inadequate preparation, unclear objectives, and a rotating door deployment system that destroyed unit cohesion. The fact that they functioned at all under these conditions is remarkable. This concludes our three-part series on the greatest fears of the Vietnam War. If you haven't watched parts 1 and 2, please go back and watch them. Together, these 3 videos provide a comprehensive look at what made Vietnam such a psychologically brutal conflict. To the Vietnam veterans watching this series, thank you for your service, your sacrifice, and for sharing your experiences in the comments. Your testimonies have confirmed that these fears were real, constant, and defining aspects of the war. For everyone else, please share this series. The more people who understand what Vietnam veterans experienced, the better we can honor their service and support them. I encourage you to read veteran memoirs, explore the oral history archives, and continue learning about this crucial period in American history. Remember these 15 fears. Remember what was asked of these men. And remember that many still carry these burdens today. Thank you for watching this series. Like, subscribe, and check out our other historical content.